Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. This is episode 96. We are slowly inching our way towards our 100th episode. I am so excited that 2 years later, we are here. If you have any suggestions or ideas for us to celebrate our 100th episode, make sure you find me on Instagram. We're doing a poll about what our 100th episode should be about. I have a few ideas. So let me know what you think. Just head to my Instagram profile, or you could also write back to me on my newsletter. I'll be doing the same campaign there as well. On the show today, I have one of our guests back. Vikram Jeet Singh is again on the podcast, and I've lost count how many times Vikram has been gracious enough to come back to the show and to share his knowledge and wisdom. And he puts in so much effort into these conversations and really does research and comes so well prepared. And it is so sincere that it really warms my heart to have these type of guests for you week after week. And I've said this often, and I'm going to say it again, that the Let's Talk Yoga podcast is where it is today because of the generosity of all the guests we have who come on the show, as well as your continuing support. So thank you. Now, Vikram and I talk about a very interesting and significant topic in popular yoga. We are looking at the history of Vinyasa yoga. Now, I have been wanting to do a detailed history of yoga series on the podcast. It's not possible to pack everything into one episode. But Vikram and I are specifically talking about Vinyasa yoga and tracing its origins, bringing clarity. We get into everything from what is Vinyasa to how it originated. Is it a style of yoga? And just completely building a conversation about its transmission from India to different parts of the world where Vinyasa is today, the different branches of it, and a more detailed contextualization of Vinyasa. Okay. As always, I have linked to everything that Vikram mentions in the show notes, which are available at letstalk.yoga. I hope you find this conversation enriching. If you enjoy these episodes, then please take a moment to rate and review the Let's Talk Yoga podcast on Apple Podcasts. I know every week we have new listeners joining in. And because a lot of you take these suggestions seriously to leave us a review, to share the podcast, it's really helping us bring this free content into the hands of new listeners and really helping make these guests and their knowledge more freely available. So once again, thank you so much for taking a moment to leave a review. I will see you on the other side of this conversation. Hi, my name is Arundhati, and you're listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm an ex-Bollywood dancer turned yoga and wellness educator. I've built a 6-figure business as an immigrant, woman of color yoga teacher with no business background, no handstands, pure instinct, and the free information found on Google. If you love doing yoga and you dream of teaching it someday, this podcast is for you. We go over everything from doing and teaching yoga to scaling a small business, living a modern yoga lifestyle, and so much more. You'll find interesting, fun, raw conversations along with some tips, tricks, strategies, and insights in this podcast. So grab your cup of chai and let's jump in. Hi, Vikram. Welcome back to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast.
Hi, Aru. Thanks for having me back again.
I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that you come back so willingly on the podcast. I know I have asked you so many times, and each time you're like, yes, let's do it. The conversations we get into, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about it, preparing for these conversations and adding so much value to this platform. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge it. I know the listeners enjoy it when you're here. They learn so much from you. I keep hearing how much they engage a lot with the content, even though we get into some heavy topics and discussions. So just, thank you for being back.
Thank you. And, in the same breath, just want to quickly acknowledge, I know it takes a lot of work to put these episodes together. And I know you're very diligent in your planning, selecting your speakers, offering your audience such a wide array of insightful, meaningful conversations in yoga. So thank you for doing that. And I'm sure I say that on behalf of myself and everyone else who's been on the show will perhaps come on the show after me.
Thank you. And, when I wanted to create this podcast, I wanted just a space where people could go access just yoga knowledge, information, teachers. And I wanted it to be this timeless space that people could go into. So it's valid today, 10 years down the line. If somebody is studying yoga, it's still valid. And I'm hoping we are getting there, and guests like you help me get there. So I guess the feeling is mutual. So today we're going to talk about the history of Vinyasa yoga. And I've been wanting to get into history of yoga in a very structured way on the podcast so people listening can get a clearer understanding. I strongly believe that the more yoga teachers understand where yoga is from, what context, it started in, and just getting, the more the better we'll do. That's how I see it. Okay? It makes people feel a lot more connected to the practice. But Vinyasa yoga, right? Especially in North America, when people think yoga, they think Vinyasa yoga. And it is one of the more recognized styles of yoga. It is popular, and we'll get into probably reasons of why it's popular a little later. But on a very high level, what is Vinyasa?
That's such a great question to begin with. And so let's start with the basics, right? Let's try and do what we do with most words from Sanskrit and try and find a relatable definition to serve our current purpose. So from that perspective, you can break the word down into nyasa and vi. Nyasa to place, to arrange, to group, and vi in a specific way. And the end result of that vinyasa, of this process, is to bring about fluidity, continuity. Almost you're creating a container which is balanced. So that to me would be like a working definition of what vinyasa would be if translated. Now, if you look at how we would look at the term vinyasa, depending on what one's practice looks like, who one studies with, and so on and so forth, vinyasa could mean a yoga asana class that is challenging. Vinyasa could mean a yoga asana class that is faster paced. Vinyasa could mean a yoga asana class that would have lots of Surya Namaskars in them. Vinyasa could mean a class that is going to be high on cardiovascular components. Sometimes vinyasa is just referred to, the what we call as the flow in yoga parlance, high plank, chaturanga, up dog, down dog. So sometimes I would hear a teacher say, take a vinyasa, and that's what someone would end up doing. So there is lots of different ways in the way that word has morphed. Sometimes I see interesting combinations like a hatha vinyasa class, which makes me sometimes wonder. So we leave that for a separate question, maybe.
Yes. I do want to get into that a little later, though.
Yeah. So I think it's how some words just have a generic meaning. So if I was to stick with that perspective, a generic meaning of the word vinyasa for a yoga practitioner would mean a class that would have a faster pace, a more flowing component to it, as opposed to a static, slower class.
Understood. So that brings me to my next question. How does vinyasa fit into the grand scheme of yoga? When we say vinyasa, are we specifically talking about an asana style, or is there more to this? Can you just help, probably just a zoomed out, version of where does vinyasa fit in the grand scheme of yoga? I mean, it's a heavy question.
But... Yeah. I want to say that in the grand scheme of yoga, if someone is not practicing a style of yoga that has some sort of a traditional or a newer lineage base to it, it would broadly fall under this rubric of vinyasa yoga. Vinyasa yoga just has kind of taken over the yoga scene, if that's the right word, as a generic class where the focus is going to be on whoever is teaching the class. So from sequencing to themes to a peak pose, there's lots that can be added under this big rubric of vinyasa. And I think that's why it's one of the most popular styles. And I say styles because there's not really any other way to define it. Do you know what I mean? Because it's so person specific.
So true. And everybody can create their own type of vinyasa, right? Quite literally,
Correct.
there could be Vikram's vinyasa, there could be Aru's vinyasa. I think that is why a lot of people are generally confused about what vinyasa is. Like a lot of yoga teachers who actually teach vinyasa yoga are unclear of its origins. And it actually has, and correct me if I'm wrong, it actually has pretty clear origins, and which is what I'm hoping we'll unpack in a moment here. But I think it is important for us to just pause on this fact that there are different types of vinyasa today. There is what I like to call the original Ashtanga vinyasa. And then there are these sub-styles, these offshoots of vinyasa. And I think when you look at it like that, it can be confusing or it can bring you clarity. Now, where am I going with all of this? Can we talk about how did vinyasa actually originate? Like if we look back at history, yoga history, under what circumstances and context did vinyasa begin?
It's a great question. And, all things vinyasa eventually would find their way back to Krishnamacharya. So I would say that would be the starting point for all things vinyasa. I also want to make the distinction that pre-Krishnamacharya, the asana component in this broader genre of yoga is very firmly established. Most, at least the texts that are available to us today, either from the Hatha school or from the Tantra schools, have already been written. They've already been written, they've been codified. Practice on the ground is very strong and very flourishing. But this concept of vinyasa, this concept of movement, this concept of trying to create a container where a breath is used as a tool or staying in the pose is used as a tool, all of that would start with Krishnamacharya.
Okay.
And when we go there, that's where pretty much from that point is where that I would say would be the root, if you will. And anything that has grown from there has a branch, a sub branch, a sub branch, but it will all originate from there.
Got it. So another question for you here about Krishnamacharya. So did he learn vinyasa yoga from his teachers or someone else? Or did he invent it or create it?
That's again a great question. And again, I wish I could say that my answer is 100% correct and it's the truth. I don't know if I can make that claim since I've never personally studied with him, grew up, was not alive in that era, was not witnessing this synthesis, this evolution myself. So based on all that I have researched, have read, like you, I share a passion for history. So we will never know for a fact if the story of Krishnamacharya is true or not, right down to his own son sharing the autobiography. A lot of living teachers today who have been direct students of Krishnamacharya, we will never know. I think specifically from the West, scholars will try and find holes. They will plug different theories to almost try and disprove that theory. But I think my perspective is neither to disprove a theory or to prove a theory, but offer different perspectives, different opinions. So, and this is a common story, right? That Krishnamacharya has Ram Mohan Brahmachari as his teacher. And while we don't know about that, there is obviously the Yoga Karunta, which has never been found. No one's ever seen a physical copy of it. It's also hard to find from an academic perspective any references to Yoga Karunta. But what we do know is that this person had that knowledge. This person had in his repertoire this plethora of asanas. This person was alive and living and in 1934 teaching in the Mysore Palace. This person, Krishnamacharya, also had as one of his main students, Patabi Joyce, who would be taught those asanas. And even that system, and I can speak a little bit to it personally for that system, has grown, has evolved over the years. We can also look and see how in his later years, Krishnamacharya and then his lineage through Mr. Desikachar turning into Vini Yoga and Sri Iyengar in his style and Patabi Joyce and the Ashtanga Vinyasa style has morphed into three very separate schools, though they have the same foundation. Based on all of that, I cannot say with full certainty that Krishnamacharya was the inventor, but I can tell you without a doubt that looking at what was happening on the ground, looking at the massive surge in the physicality, we are speaking pre-independence here. So the last few years under the British rule, there was this huge surge, this huge surge of physicality to almost claim back the nation, kind of coupled with everything else that's happening. Definitely Krishnamacharya has synthesized, brought together, has had the foresight to create a system that has now lasted 150 years plus and probably will for hundreds more.
Thank you for that, because I know it's very hard to really get a clear picture of to trace any of this. And I also feel, especially with people in the West, they have this very romantic view of yoga, of Krishnamacharya spent 7 years in the cave in the Himalayas, and he studied with Ram Mohan Brahmachari, and he learned vinyasa, and he left only because this is things I've heard, Vikram. You can stop me at any point and say, no, that's incorrect. And then when it was 7 years in, his teacher said, now go teach yoga to everyone else. And that's how he came back into society and stuff like that. And again, you're right. For every scholar who says this happened, another 5 scholars will say, no, this did not happen this way. So it's very hard to say with certainty, was it like this? And I think a lot of Westerners don't understand that yoga is such a personalized journey to all these. It's supposed to be a personalized journey, right? You don't really broadcast everything. That is a new age thing. Constantly talking about yoga, talking about your teachers, talking about your learning as you're learning it. So a lot of these teachers from the past, these masters, they were very private about their journey. And they kept a lot of things to themselves, which I don't think a lot of modern yoga teachers grasp in entirety, because we live in a different world.
100%. I mean, just a quick, massive jump in the past. We out of the blue from asanas being predominantly seated with the sole purpose of dhyana, we suddenly find the first 2 asanas being codified as kukutasana, rooster pose, and mayurasana. Imagine.
It's a big jump, yeah.
Who thought of that? We don't know. They just appeared in the text. But so that means that it's not that things weren't moving, things weren't happening. It's also sometimes hard because we try and make sense of what was happening 600-700 years ago with everything that we have today. It's how I guess a 5-year-old would feel if I gave my daughter a cassette tape. She would just think
she wouldn't know what to do with it.
Maybe she would peep in through those holes and ask me, Papa, what's this? Is this a toy? So it's also interesting sometimes. And that's why I, in all my lectures, in any conversations like this, I say be open and read every possible version and then try and make some sense, some semblance for it. For some, we will have very clear answers. And for some we won't. And that, unfortunately or fortunately, is how yoga has evolved.
So true. And putting that into perspective is important. And I think, right, and I know guests on the podcast, like you do this often, you make teachers reflect and you make them pause and think twice about how we are consuming something and what we're doing with this knowledge and information. So I think that's really valuable, because it's like we keep downloading all of this information, and I'm doing air quotes here, but we don't really assimilate in the way that we're supposed to. It's all surface level learning. So it takes effort and time to go deeper, to really unpack what is under the layers. And I think that's necessary as the more access we have to yoga information. And I would argue that not everything is actually, authentic yoga information. It's important to verify and reflect and come to your own understanding, and not necessarily have to take sides or even reach a conclusion, which is, I think, some along the lines of what you were saying. And I think that's very important. It gets lost sometimes in communication.
For sure.
So coming back to Krishnamacharya, right? I completely hear you when you say we can trace a lot of vinyasa to Krishnamacharya. You mentioned the British rule. Right now, as you and I, we know a lot about Indian independence struggle and how that happened and what the British did to India. But for the listeners who are probably not very in touch with Indian history, okay, and the Indian independence struggle, can you talk a bit more about the impact of the British rule on yoga?
Again, unfortunately, one that's a researched answer, but not too much guesswork is needed here. One doesn't have to, if one has grown up in India or has lived in India for a fair amount of time or has gone back and forth, one can only see almost this resurgence of a lot of the ancient sciences, I would say,
Mhm.
which had been suppressed, which had to almost hide or go underground for a very long period of time. And I was saying this to someone that it's it's quite unfortunate that we had this little gap of almost 150 odd years where things came to a standstill. Because going back to the first part of the conversation, on the ground we had a very wide, diverse, thriving yoga culture catering to a lot of different sects and walks of life in society. And again, from testimonials, from recorded events, let's say the sannyasi rebellion, the fight against anyone who did not conform to, I say this in air quotes, a non-violent yogi approach. Anything that was more on physicality was clamped, shut down, chased. In some cases, in 1771, there were 150 saints that were put to death for no reason. It's one of those mysterious occurrences in the British Raj, which and a couple of other factors like the Bengal famine that led to the sannyasi rebellion. But there was a lot of backpedaling that had to be done. And it's almost ironic that what was quelled was the physicality, but majority of what eventually got transported was the physical piece again. It's
so true.
So it's quite ironic that what was crushed is pretty much what went and kind of spread the most quickly, and now it's eventually hopefully turning into more of a well-rounded approach. But I would say the repercussions are not just suppression. The repercussions are not just perhaps foiling the advancement of a growing culture, of a growing science, but also putting the hack. I thankfully did not grow up in that era, but 2 generations up from my father did. Things that would have been available, things that would have been a way of life were not. And it's hard to say how far reaching that would be. What would things have looked like? It's very hard for me to make a constructive guess on that. But I would say it definitely has impacted, this growth, this natural growth that was happening. And I hate to say it, if you, and this I can speak from personal experience, it's only recently that there's been this resurgence of having diverse voices, in the Western world of yoga. It's almost ironic, and you and I are on the same page. No one has a claim to yoga based on their ethnicity, but it would be very ironic if someone who was naturally steeped in that culture had to really scream the loudest to be heard, or at most times we're not even given a chance to speak. So that, if you ask me, is a modern day trickle down effect of what was on the ground here, pre-independence. It has had
Mhm.
much far-reaching consequences for, let's say, people in my generation.
Mhm. Mhm. So true. There is so much there. I bring up this issue of the British rule because often it's just forgotten. And a lot of people who don't have context, and when I say people, I'm referring to yoga teachers, they beat up on India and Indian culture and how things have happened in the past. And you can't, that's just an opinion. And it's not
Mhm.
going to be very productive, right? And it builds in bias. You have to look at the time and space that all these things happened under, the circumstances, the context. It's like how sometimes people say, oh, people in India don't do yoga. And and I'm like, no, wait, you think yoga is just poses in a studio. And again, I don't want to get into go in that direction because then you and I will be here for another hour talking about it. But I bring it up because people need to hear it. And you're right, in terms of voices like yours and mine. There were a few reasons why I started the podcast. One of them was I was like, okay, I know so many amazing yoga teachers, most of them who are Indian, who don't get a voice on any platform. So let's just create the platform. And let's just bring these voices on a platform. We don't need other people to invite us to their platforms. And that's kind of how, honestly, I think a rebellion side of me created a podcast.
No,
Uh,
that's a fair point.
and at some level, I feel like there is a certain amount of insecurity in modern yoga, popular yoga, yoga teachers. And we forget that we are here to serve the yoga. We are not here to serve ourselves. But I can go down this rabbit hole for a very long time. So I'm going to reel myself back in and maybe talk to you about all of this offline. So let's go back to the sport of yoga. Okay. Right after independence, right? Is that when Vinyasa yoga started moving out of India? So, what I'm asking here, Vikram, is how did Vinyasa from this little place in Mysore jump across the seas? And how did it spread to the rest of the world?
That's where, that's why I said the lineage or the line kind of continues. So we can debate how much of it was, if you ask me, not much of it was inherited. Most of it was created, and that from one creation from from Krishnamacharya to Pattabhi Joyce, that would be the other person who would be involved in that transmission. In this transmission,
Mm-hmm.
very specifically, because we're not talking about physical asana per se, but since we are talking about vinyasa,
Mm-hmm.
not too many. So Indra Devi is the one recorded person we have who studied directly with Krishnamacharya, who obviously brought yoga in the 70s to the West, with her
Mm-hmm.
with her line of celebrity students and the first studio in Hollywood and so on. But specifically from a vinyasa perspective, that transmission would sit with Pattabhi Joyce. There's
Mm-hmm.
I would, so to give a quick caveat, I would say that single-handedly for most of the popularization of yoga, and I'd say very specifically in the UK, I'm not going to say Europe, that would rest with Sri Iyengar. I would say early 1960s, mid 1970s, the growth of asana yoga in UK specifically
Mm-hmm.
would sit with BKS Iyengar.
Mm-hmm.
The counterpart in that same phase, I believe, Pattabhi Joyce's first trip was 74 to California
Mm-hmm.
of Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga would sit with Pattabhi Joyce. So till the time he went over and the numbers drastically at a significant level increased, there were enough
Mm-hmm.
Westerners coming, learning 4 months, 5 months, going back. We have enough. By that time, we had, video available and other documented evidence available
Mm-hmm.
of that slow trickle of Ashtanga into the West world. But I would say post 74 and him traveling for the first time would open up the floodgates of Vinyasa per se. If I think of two names, and again, this is just stats, for those who like that, the two names would be, I would say, I'm trying to think. I think it's around the same time, 1994, 1995 is when you have the first offshoots happening of Vinyasa yoga, non-Ashtanga style, not hot yoga,
Power yoga.
power yoga, which would eventually find its own sub branches and so on, so forth.
There are so many things you just packed into that response. I want to just go back and pause on a few things. So,
Sure.
just to remind the listeners, back when Krishnamacharya used to teach, it was not, correct me if I'm wrong, he never really taught group classes, at least what little documentation is available. It was largely one-on-one or very small groups, correct?
That is
Yeah.
That is
Yes.
correct. In his first original shala, one could only accommodate 12 students. So that would be the extent of that group size per se.
Perfect. And he also had what we now recognize as some very popular or famous students. And you said this already at an earlier point in the interview. One of them was B.K.S. Iyengar. One of them was Patabi Joyce. Then there is Desi Kachar. And there are a few others on that list. I'm just calling that out more for the listeners, just to remind them that Krishnamacharya had all these students who then did set up their own ways of teaching yoga. And there's no real point I want to make right here. I'm just trying to remind the listeners of where we were earlier in the conversation. So when you say non-Ashtanga, I think that is very important. You said in 1995, suddenly, there was, until that point, Ashtanga, when you said Vinyasa, you meant Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga. And in Ashtanga Vinyasa style of yoga, we're not referring to Patanjali's 8 limbs. I want to call that out because it's a question I get asked often. That is different. The Ashtanga Marga from Patanjali, that is different. Here, when we refer to Ashtanga Vinyasa in this conversation, we're referring to the style of yoga, okay? A style of practicing asana. And if there's a better way to say that, please feel free to stop me. But in 1995 or somewhere there, right, for the first time, people started breaking away from the lineage of Ashtanga yoga. And I'm again doing air quotes here. And what this meant was you could now practice asana with creative sequencing, right? That means you didn't have to follow the set sequence, the primary sequence, the secondary sequence. You could now make your own combination, your own style. You could play music, you could do something else. And that's kind of the, for lack of a better word, the birth of many different new age vinyasa yoga styles. Am I summing that up correctly?
Yep, that's a great summary. So the woman whose name I was trying to recollect, because I've never really taken a class with her. It was more in terms of doing my research. So Beryl Bender Birch, Brian Kest, Baron Baptiste, and Larry Schultz. So these would be few of the original, and most of your listeners, especially in the modern genre, probably might have heard of Baron Baptiste and some connection there, but the other names would perhaps be unknown. But you could say these were the predominantly the pioneers of power yoga, and all of them. I'm not sure about Beryl Bender. I think she studied with one of Patabi Joyce's Norman Allen, who was one of Patabi Joyce's first students. But everyone else has directly studied with Patabi Joyce and then have gone on to form their version of power yoga. I do want to take a moment and mention Larry Schultz because he actually was very influential, and also he got a lot of bad press as well initially, branching out and trying to combine his claim to fame and his method. I believe it still exists. It's called rocket yoga. And I think in 1990, in that same genre, 1990 to 1995, is when Schultz launched Rocket Yoga, which was kind of like a fusion of the first, second, and the third series from Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga.
So probably what some of the listeners are thinking is, why break away from Ashtanga Vinyasa, right? Why not just stick to it? The system was already set up. Why this need to create something different?
My honest answer is because perhaps the demand of the original system the commitment of the original system, time and otherwise, and maybe actually I wouldn't say physical intensity because some of these styles are a lot more physically intensive and a lot more unsafe than the original
Mhm.
sequencing, would be an adaptation of quote unquote the modern life. You know, if one cannot come to the studio or cannot come to the shala X
Mhm.
number of days, maybe come on these days. If this feels too hard, skip this. Maybe the desire to recreate and reinvent, maybe the desire to put your name on something. I see
Mhm.
a lot of these styles of so and so, like prefix, their name in yoga.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
Maybe a desire to want to own something, to patent something,
Mhm.
maybe to find commercial success and make
Yes.
it
Mhm.
new, exciting, viable, fun,
Fresh,
fresh.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. And I just wanted to bring that up because sometimes people will say when it already existed, then why create something new? And I'm like, capitalism and how the world
Mhm.
works today. And you're so right when you say all of this. So you said something that I want to pick up on. It's not necessarily safe for everybody. Can we talk about, is vinyasa a style that is suitable for everyone? Is there something that we need to be aware of if someone's listening to this and they've never done vinyasa and they want to start? Though I find someone having not done vinyasa very rare in today's popular yoga field, at least. But in India, at least where I practiced, right? There was vinyasa, but there was also all these other non vinyasa styles of yoga, which I feel sometimes the West, or depending on where you live, you don't get to see as much. You don't get exposure to that much, to all of that. So, is vinyasa safe for everyone? And who should perhaps look at something other than vinyasa?
Yeah. So one slight caveat, even
Mm-hmm.
though these folks, and this is again not an embodied answer. I've not been in any of these teachers' classes. None of them really teach anymore. There was still some element of continuity. I'm not sure what their reasons were for branching out and creating whatever they did. There was still some element of personal embodiment that they had carried from their years of practice with their teacher. But that thing is now long gone. What we have now is this fusion hybrid. We
Mm-hmm.
were, as it is, riding the wave of physical culture, and that's at an all new level, where one of the main, what how should I say it, where one of the main rewards of your asana practice should be this toned, flexible, can be put in a very stereotype kind of physical body that one should have.
Mm-hmm.
So that has also given rise to the vinyasa culture per se, right? Where it's all about more. How much can I experiment? How much can I sequence? How harder can I make?
Mm-hmm.
Once I saw a studio schedule, and they had something that was called Vinyasa 3. So it had
What is that?
Vinyasa, and so I went on a whim to take the class, and I've been practicing for a little while. I'm pretty comfortable in moving my body, and it's not that. So that class was marked as being a really challenging class and only for the advanced practitioners, and if you're new to yoga, don't come. But I've never in my whole life taken like a boot camp, but that's what it felt like. It
Uh-huh.
was Vinyasa 3, but the class was full of hard to do for 95% of the class,
Oh, that's
either
so sad.
arm balances. And I think we might have done like 100 push-ups, you know?
Oh,
So yeah.
my
So
shoulders would detach from my body at that point.
so unfortunately, that's what's that's the rep that
Mm, mhm.
that a vinyasa class, how hard can I make it to be? So if that so I would again exercise the practitioner to use their discernment. If they are not
Yes.
well firmly established in this modern parlance of what the physicality of an asana class can be, in a class that seems and a class that seems to have as its main objective a hard component. It's going to be a hard class. It's going to be a sweaty class, or whatever word has been used. Then I would maybe check and figure out what's expected in that class,
Mm-hmm.
what's the pace of the class, is there are there any other instructions given? Because so many times, like myself, out of curiosity, but I saw people in that class, a lot of the folks in that class should not have been doing that class. It did not make sense for, I want to say, 95% of the class. And and I'm not even going to get into the larger aspect of, is that sustainable, and is that in any way benefiting me on this larger path of yoga? I'll stay away from that.
Mm-hmm.
Just even from an experience perspective, it wasn't a safe experience. So I would strongly recommend, if someone is new to yoga and they're practicing at a place that they don't know, I would just ask more about something that's labeled as a vinyasa class, because I think we might have gotten a little carried away in the
Yes.
in
Mm-hmm.
the times we live in, in trying to define what a vinyasa class should be and what should it entail and what should be, I guess, the end goal, the objective of the class. What is
Mm-hmm.
one trying to achieve at the end of this class?
So true. And it is heartbreaking to hear how 95% of that class couldn't keep up. And I have been in these situations too, right? And I'm just sometimes looking at the teacher in wonder, like, don't you see? Nobody is able to do any of this. And don't you also see that 90% of this class is not going to come back? And then they will tell all their friends, yoga is too hard. Don't do yoga ever again. And it just defeats the purpose of it. And while I feel like that we should save this for a complete different conversation, right? But it is, I'm glad you bring it up because it's important for us to know that if it's not suitable, then I always try to tell the student, create a little extra time and do the beginner's course, at least at our studio. Right?
Yeah.
Do the beginner's course. Because how does someone who knows nothing about yoga pick a class? They look at the schedule and they say, okay, this is convenient. This is convenient. I'm just going to show up. So I really try to emphasize, and I hope other teachers give themselves the freedom to do this, to tell them that we got to set a foundation. And to set the foundation, can you spend these many weeks in the beginner's class? It'll help you for life, or whatever else you label that class as. And I think we as people who guide these classes or lead these classes, we should recognize who needs to be guided a little more in practice and not be hesitant to tell them, like, here, I don't know, it's probably a Seattle thing, or maybe it's a North America thing. People hesitate to speak directly with their students. Like teachers hesitate because what if you hurt their feelings? I'm like, it's not about feelings. They'll hurt their physical body if they're in an arm balance class when they don't know how to do a down dog properly. And just telling them that here are your options. Do you want to consider them? And I think we as teachers need to open up that dialogue a lot more.
For sure.
And make the students realize that there are options and let me help you navigate to those options. I know this is convenient, but there's also X, Y, and Z that could work really well for you. And I just feel like we should say that more openly.
I completely agree. And it's interesting, I was thinking in that class, it was a long time ago, but, since this conversation came up, it made me think of that. We also maybe as teachers need to spend some time redefining what is advanced. To me,
Yes.
to be able to hold a warrior two for 4 minutes would be
Wow.
a lot more advanced than me trying to kick my legs up against the wall in some sort of a lopsided handstand, or try to do 30 push-ups, or like we need to define. It's because maybe we got bored. We got bored of doing the foundational asana, so we had to invent, and that's okay. I'm sure there's a time and place for everything. But this whole concept, I kept thinking back to how the qualifier to go to a Vinyasa 3 was an advanced practitioner, but an advanced practitioner in that class would probably walk, my version of advanced practitioner would walk out of that class, because if I'm in a pose
So
literally for 3 breaths and I'm jumping into the next pose, where is the advancement? It's anyway.
No, it's such an important topic. And I think, I made a side note here that sometime on the podcast, I need to bring up this topic of what is advanced yoga and setting our mindset around this conversation of advanced, because we use the physical metric, right? The physical body and the poses we do the as our measurement for advanced asana. So you can do an arm balance that's more advanced than Virabhadrasana 2. I would argue the other way. Like you said, can you just stay in it and be content and be fully present and just immerse yourself in that versus do a 2 second something where you've barely gotten in and out. Half the time your mind was not even there, your breath wasn't even there. I think it's a very important conversation. Maybe I will reach out to you again and be like, do you want to come back and talk about this sometime?
Yeah, I would love to have some great thoughts around that.
Okay, wonderful. I will put that down for a future episode. So as we wrap things up here, right? Can we talk about where Vinyasa yoga is today? And it could be in terms of Ashtanga Vinyasa, the lineage, or just Vinyasa as a whole, because everything is evolving, right? So where is the lineage today?
In my experience, I would say that Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga as a lineage is strong, steady, still based out of Mysore, still draws a huge number of teachers, followers, practitioners, some there for multiple decades, some brand new. As you know, I spent the last month in Mysore, and there was someone who had come to Mysore for the first time, and they had signed up to practice at the main shala there for 3 months, and I became friends with them, and it was great to see their asana practice evolve with time. They had some time, they blocked off 3 months, and they came. So I think as far as that part of the world that has kept ties with the Joyce lineage from Mysore, or specifically Sharad Joyce, who's the teacher now, alive, thriving, well. And I would say most schools, new or old, have kind of used that classic framework and then morph into whatever makes sense for them. It's very hard to think of a vinyasa class, and at least in my experience that I've taken, that did not have some classic Ashtanga poses, that did not have a Surya Namaskar A or B, that did not have Surya Namaskars as transition poses. And then the list is endless. Some would go on to adding arm balances, some would not. But I would say that more or less the vinyasa world sits at this cusp of still using that foundation as its core, because let's face it, without that foundation, there would be nothing. There would be just random movements in the air, right? So that still continues to be the common ground. And then from there, whatever has evolved, I think I saw somewhere I saw a vinyasa weights class. So it's the same thing, but there's some light weights in people's hands as they're
becoming a thing here.
Okay. But see, that's the thing. You know why I laugh? Because we have somehow convinced everybody that if you do multitasking in any sphere of your life, you are the the person. Yeah, yes. You're on top of it. God forbid if you are a person who is focusing on one task at a time. Oh my God, you would be, as rare as the dinosaurs, because if you're not juggling 3 things at least at the same time, are you even living in the 21st century? So,
oh, it's so true. So true. Yeah. And I don't like to call it a pet peeve, but something that I know bothers me a lot is how we're trying to squeeze yoga and aspects of yoga like meditation and pranayama and all of that into like time efficient chunks, like 5 minutes, 3 minutes, you turn on an app and you can meditate for like 3 minutes. And the rest of the 23 plus hours, and 57 or 56 minutes, your life is completely, okay, let me say my life is a mess. And everything is chaotic. And then you sit, you close your eyes, and you'll just see that chaos with closed eyes. And we're all trying to get more time efficient in some of these practices. And it just cracks me up sometimes. I'm like, are we getting better or are we getting worse?
Yeah, no, I hear you. So I would say that, this is my little 2 cents, or since I'm in India, my 2 paise, would be that, if you're someone who is teaching vinyasa, maybe somewhere at the back of your mind have a really strong foundation on what the end objective is. And I understand there's challenges. I understand there is pressures of being new, being fresh, being creative. But one can do all of that and still somewhere at the back of their mind, have a grounded objective that they're trying to achieve in this time that they have with their students, with
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
with physical asana as the
Mm-hmm.
main tool. It's great if you can throw in something else outside of that, but if you're going to primarily work on moving the body, have some sort of a grounded objective that is embodied, that you have practiced, that you did not see somewhere, that did not look cool, that's not trending, and that is sustainable, because that's what will make one a good teacher. The students will come back to that teacher who can create that lasting experience. Because if you're offering these one hits, then your students will keep trying to find those one hits, if not with you, with someone else, but not with someone else, with
Yes.
someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
teach vinyasa. Vinyasa, I'm sure, is a beautiful practice, on its own. And it's great if one feels called to innovation, creativity, safe sequencing. We have all these things that can be lumped together in that broad genre of vinyasa. That's great. But somewhere at the back of your mind, kind of having that strong foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And since we started with Krishnamacharya, in, I believe it's health and healing. I might need to go back and confirm that for you. But Desikachar says that, he says, and I'm literally quoting him, Vinyasa is, I believe, one of the richest concepts to emerge from yoga for the successful conduct of our actions and relationships. We only tend to think of vinyasa as a flow, as a move, as a stand-alone thing that one does. But in its truest sense, the concept of vinyasa, at least in my understanding, was done to create this container. And a container is full, it's wholesome. So if your vinyasa practice, if your vinyasa teaching can keep that container whole and not split in fragments, not as an experience, then I think it has some merit. It has some longevity.
That's beautifully said. And you bring up very, very important points that have to, especially in this response, really to reflect on. And I am in 100% agreement that you can teach vinyasa, you can be creative, you can do safe sequencing, you can, for, again, air quotes, you can think out of the box to make it relevant, but you have to do it in a way where it's still yoga and it's still grounded in what yoga stands for. And it is possible. And there are teachers who are doing that very successfully. And it takes time, effort, patience, and the presence of, I would say, credible teachers on your journey. Yeah, because I feel like that's the end of most of my conversations. You have to have a teacher, you have to have that foundation, without which it's really hard to move forward. So Vikram, once again, I want to thank you for coming back on this podcast, for loving on the podcast and giving it so much each time you are here. I already know we are lined up for our next conversation on what is advanced yoga at some point, but thank you. I'm sure this conversation about tracing the origins of vinyasa, the history, will help a lot of yoga teachers out there. Can you once again tell everyone where they can find you on the internet?
Yes. So my Instagram handle is Wandering Mad, kind of like a traveling mad. So Wandering Mad, that's my Instagram handle. And and I guess the podcast would be up on the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. So please feel free to reach out either there or through social media on my Instagram handle. And I'm very happy to listen to any thoughts, suggestions, comments, take questions, whatever the case may be. Very happy to support you on your journey.
Thank you so much, Vikram.
Thanks, Arup.
As always, thanks for listening. Remember, you can be a part of my mentorship community. It's called the Mindful Yoga Teachers Club. We meet every month, and you can find all details at letstalk.yoga. I will see you next week with a brand new guest and a new conversation. Until then, remember to enjoy your practice, and I'll see you soon.